Hello, everyone. My name is Dee Magnoni, co-president of CivicStory. On behalf of CivicStory trustees, welcome to our News and Humanities Forum entitled Framing the News, Can Humanities Build Audience Engagement? Thank you so much for being here. We also thank the New Jersey Council for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities for the incubation grant received last May that makes this forum possible. So what do we mean by humanities? In this forum, we're defining it broadly as the public humanities, subjects that ask in some way what it means to be human. History, language, literature, philosophy, religion, civics, arts, and law. We hope this spurs some questions. Are any topics a surprise? Which design is preferred? How do they relate to the news? And now it's a great pleasure to introduce our forum co-moderators. Carlett Spike is editor for CivicStory's Humanities Reporter project. She's a freelance writer and editor based in New Jersey, associate editor of the Princeton Alumni Weekly magazine, and a graduate of Columbia University School of Journalism. Welcome, Carlett. Judith Stark is a professor of philosophy and the environment at Seton University. She is a published author in the fields of ethics, political theory, and environmental philosophy, and she helped create the Environmental Studies program and Women in Gender Studies program. Welcome, Judith. Thanks to you both for facilitating the conversation. Over to you.
Thanks for the intro, Dee. We really appreciate it. Again, welcome everybody to tonight's forum, Framing the News, Can Humanities Build Audience Engagement? As Dee said, I'm Carlett Spike and I'm co-moderating with Judith Stark. I'd like to start off by briefly introducing our speakers who will be able to tell you more about themselves as they present, but we'll start with first, we have Robin Wilson Glover. She's director of Mosaic and Digital Opinion at NewJersey.com. We have Deborah Yaffe, a freelance journalist who is working with CivicStory as our humanities reporter, and Nicola Menzie, the founder and managing editor of Faithfully magazine. They will each tell us more about themselves and their publications in a few minutes, but I'm actually going to turn it over to Judith, who will begin with a few words to define what the humanities mean and their relationship to the news.
Thank you, Carlett. So do I have the whole hour to do this? To define the humanities? Okay. I'll do it fast. I'll do it fast. Okay. So this is my thinking about it. Humanities are the ways we human beings have of being in the world. It is our way of being in the world. It's our way of seeing the world. It is our way of telling stories, making stories, because we human beings are great story makers and storytellers. And I just don't mean written words or words on paper. Certainly we started as storytellers in the oral tradition for thousands and thousands, probably millions of years. And I would include stories as the cave paintings, like the cave paintings of Lascaux. These are stories. I would include all of that in humanities. These are the ways that we raise large questions about ourselves. Do we ever come to final answers? No, we don't. But we keep looking for those answers. We keep living out those answers in as full, transparent, and ethical ways that we can. So that's my thumbnail sketch. And as I said, it includes thousands of years of what human beings have been capable of doing and what we continue to do to answer the great question of Socrates, to live the examined life. And this is what humanities helps us to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to remind everybody on right now that you can feel free to drop questions in the chat. After our speakers give a little introduction on themselves, we will be taking questions. So you can do that throughout. Now to our speakers, let's start with Robin. Can you tell us more about yourself and the new project Mosaic? What are some of the goals of the site? And how does it differ from what NJ.com offers?
Okay, good evening. I'm Robin Wilson Glover. I've been with NJ.com for about 25 years, it's a long time. Been a journalist for about 40 years, again, a long time. And we started a new project in the fall. I would say it started probably a soft start in September, early September, a harder start later in that month. You probably, if you look at NJ.com, you probably saw ads on the site. What it is a site for people we don't typically write about on NJ.com or in the mainstream media. We started with a goal, which is if you go to the About site on Mosaic, says that we're here to celebrate the richness of our culture in the Garden State. So there you go. Our goal is to address the humanities. We don't write about crime. We don't write about car crashes. We don't write about the weather. You won't find that on Mosaic. We leave that to NJ.com and other straight news sites. You can find that information almost anywhere. We write about people of color, disabled who have done good things about issues that face us and our communities. We write about issues, especially when we need a conversation on a topic. We run commentary, often solutions on topics. We write about voting and democracy. We feel that's a very important issue to write about. And we had a guide on please get out the vote in November, and every question we could think of to answer if someone needed to vote or wanted to vote. Our whole goal is to amplify voices that have not been amplified before. And we've been doing that also through profiles of individuals from communities that you don't usually hear about and some that you have. So what we want to continue to do and how we want to continue to grow, we post probably 1 or 2 stories a day. We'd like to expand that. The only problem is, will you find it if we have 3 stories we feature, and if those 3 stories have been changed, we have to continually repeat them in order for you to find a story. But we wanted to post more. We want to include more voices and more stories on cultural issues that are often hard to do because there's so many going on at the same time and we have a very small staff. But that's Mosaic.
Can I ask about how many people are on the staff?
3. But we also take stories from NJ.com. Again, NJ.com produces stories about those communities, just not often. And if NJ.com carries a story on an issue of importance, and they often do, I would say about 1 story a day, maybe 2 stories a day, that kind of fit in that mold, which is why we started Mosaic. We need more than 1 or 2 stories a day about those community groups, right? I mean, how can you write just 1 or 2 stories about, the Black, Latino, Asian, LGBTQ disabled community in a day? So we're there to supplement it.
Great. Thank you, Robin. We sure definitely will have questions for you when we get to the Q&A. Next, we're going to go to Deborah. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your experience with the Humanities Reporter project, and your thoughts on the tools the humanities offer journalists?
Sure. So as Carlett said, I'm Deborah Yaffe. I've been a journalist mostly in New Jersey for about 34 years. Started out in daily newspaper journalism, then transitioned to freelancing and book writing. I've written 2 books, one about New Jersey's long-running school finance lawsuit, Abbott versus Burke, and the other one about Jane Austen fans, a completely different topic. And for the last few months, I have been CivicStory's Humanities Reporter under the grant that they received from the New Jersey Council on Humanities, which Susan may want to talk about later. So let me talk a little about that. So the division of academic disciplines among humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences underpins the curriculum and organizational structure of most colleges and universities. And in that context, it has a certain logic, since these categories roughly correlate with different modes of inquiry. The natural sciences essentially quantitative and empirical, the humanities essentially word-based and interpretive, and the social sciences combining elements of both approaches. Even in the academy, however, this categorization is often questioned, with scholars increasingly pursuing interdisciplinary approaches to such topics as the human response to climate change. And in general interest journalism, in my experience, it's rare for these categories to manifest at all. At most, you're likely to find a reflection of something closer to C.P. Snow's 1959 formulation of the two cultures, science versus everything else. So in that exceedingly rare space known as a well-staffed general interest newsroom, you might find science reporters covering everything from emerging pandemics to space exploration to animal behavior. So rather than focusing on the terminology here, I think it's more useful to reflect on the kinds of tools the humanities offer to journalists, how the superpowers of the humanities enrich the work of journalism. There are probably many ways of formulating what those superpowers are exactly, but I'd focus on three things. First, setting events in context, especially historical context. Second, accepting or even embracing ambiguity, uncertainty, and multiple points of view. And third, seeing storytelling, especially about the experiences of individuals, as a valid mode of understanding. So let me briefly talk about how some of these tools came into play in the three stories that I wrote for CivicStory this fall as part of the Humanities Reporting Project. My first story, published by CivicStory in October, was about the grassroots community effort to save and restore a house in Red Bank where the pioneering Black journalist and civil rights advocate T. Thomas Fortune had once lived. Fortune is no longer a household name, so it was obvious from the start that I'd need to explain why he was worth paying attention to. That meant I'd need to consult historical sources, both secondary sources like a 1972 biography, and primary sources like Fortune's 1884 treatise Black and White, and like the Red Bank newspaper that printed a front page story about his arrival in town in 1901. And I'd also need to introduce scholars specializing in African American history and literature. In other words, I had to offer some historical context to explain why community volunteers in the 21st century were bothering with this guy, and more generally, how their work fit into a larger effort to preserve vanishing monuments of African American life. So, historical contextualization, one of the tools that the humanities can offer to journalism. My second story, published by CivicStory in November, profiled Free Acres, a small North Jersey enclave with roots in a once prominent tax reform movement. This story also required historical contextualization, and so I read accounts of the community compiled by residents in the 1940s and the 1990s. I visited the Special Collections Department in the Rutgers University New Brunswick Library to look at some of their relevant holdings, and I spoke to economic historians about the theoretical underpinnings of Free Acres taxing arrangements. Mostly, though, I talked to people who live in Free Acres or who used to live there, and I tried to pay attention to the themes that emerged from those conversations. But if you talk to a dozen people, you'll get a dozen slightly different points of view. Some residents of Free Acres called the place utopian, and others said the truth was a bit more complicated. Some people thought the place was a hub of old-fashioned neighborliness, and others worried that it was changing and not for the better. Rather than assuming that some of these people were right and others were wrong, I tried to represent that diversity in the quotes that I chose and the points that I made. So ambiguity and multiplicity, another tool that the humanities can offer to journalism. My last story, which will be published by CivicStory in the next week or two, looks at the Newark City of Learning Collaborative, a community-wide effort to increase the number of people in the city who have obtained post-secondary degrees or credentials. It's a more policy-focused story than the other two, and stories like that run the risk of seeming dry to the reader. So in writing the piece, I tried to use the experiences of a Newark woman whose college career had been derailed by an unplanned pregnancy to illustrate some of the sociological and economic arguments in favor of the work of the Newark City of Learning Collaborative. Although the particulars of individual lives don't always mesh perfectly with the templates that economists rely on, this woman's story nevertheless offered an enriching perspective, leavening the abstractions favored by social scientists with a dose of the details that vivify experience. So narratives of individual lives, a third tool that the humanities can offer to journalism. Now, I wouldn't say that setting contemporary events in the context of larger ideas and historical movements, or accepting that sometimes no single point of view can be considered definitive, or using individual experiences to illuminate broader themes. I wouldn't say that these approaches constitute something called humanities journalism. I would just call all of this journalism, or at least journalism as it should be practiced when you have the time and the resources to do it right. All these tools can and should be applied to many different kinds of stories, including science stories. And if we had a science reporter on this panel, they might want to quarrel with the idea that you can separate out something called science journalism, just as much as I want to quarrel with the idea that you can fence off something called humanities journalism. In a sense, then, journalism's insistence on integrating modes of inquiry that the academy has traditionally kept separate is congruent with the scholarly drive towards interdisciplinarity. So to answer the question that's our program title tonight, I do think that the humanities can build audience engagement, but that's because the tools that the humanities give us already represent the best of what journalism can be. So that's it for me, and back to you, Carlett.
Are you going to say something, Judith?
No. Well, I could say a lot, but I won't. Anyway, that was great. And so I'm just wondering why you would drop humanities from the journal. I get the point that that's just journalism, but it kind of helps people to get a little more focus on it if you call it humanities journalism, I think. But you're the journalist. I defer to you.
I mean, it's not a term that journalists use. So
Okay.
If it helps people who are not journalists think about what journalists do, sure. But inside of the profession, I don't think too many people would use that terminology. That's really what I was trying to say.
I really appreciate your stressing ambiguity and complexity, because that's difficult for people to take in. And especially in TikTok age, in particular, and social media age, those media, that kind of medium, doesn't really lend itself to a kind of complexity or in-depth understanding. So as a journalist, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're writing longer form journalism, then that's just what you do. And you're just hoping that you can get people to spend enough time, people who are used to the shorter attention spans that TikTok demands, to get them to actually read something that's longer. So, yeah.
Right. Oh, that's a challenge we face in higher education too. Terrific. Yeah, thanks. Thank you for your work.
Thanks again, Deborah. Last but not least, we have Nicola. We want to learn more about your publication, Faithfully magazine. Can you tell us more about yourself, why you decided to start Faithfully, and how faith-related news stories can increase civic engagement?
Hi, everyone. Thanks to CivicStory for organizing and hosting this forum. And thanks to everyone who's participating and attending tonight. So my name is Nicola Menzie. I am a religion reporter. I've been working in journalism now for about 20 years, specifically in religion reporting for about 10, 12 years. And the bulk of that has been primarily focused on Christian communities. And that leads to the start of my publication, Faithfully magazine. And my simple aim in founding the publication was basically to create another platform, another option that would specifically focus on issues, conversations, and events impacting Christian communities of color. Now, there are several faith-based publications, of course, and many that exclusively focus on Christianity. There are also many Black-focused publications, and a few that center on Asian Americans, specifically Latino or Hispanic Americans, specifically Native Americans, and so forth. But at the time when I started seriously developing Faithfully magazine, which was in about 2016, 2017, there were no major Christian publications that brought all of these communities together, except for maybe one. Yet that publication was decidedly liberal or Christian left, which is great, but locks out readers who aren't. So also much of Christian media is predominantly white, which isn't necessarily terrible, but much of what was being produced as so-called regular coverage tended to heavily reflect the concerns and conversations of white evangelicals, which overlaps with public complaints, right, about news media in general, which Robin just told us in her introduction. So, and the complaint, of course, mainstream publications tend to overlook communities of color or produce shallow or seasonal pieces on these communities. So another aspect we wanted to lean into was also looking away from, in my context of our coverage, looking away from mega churches and, mega pastors, the ones who tend to get a lot of ink, and instead highlight more of what smaller churches and lesser known Christian leaders and activists were doing more on the local community level as well. And also at the time of the publication's founding, there were national conversations about police violence and Black Lives Matter, with cases like Trayvon Martin and later Michael Brown. And the thing we had been advocating for early in our entry, and even in our test phase, which was done primarily through a podcast, was for Christian communities to talk about race, right? There's this national conversation going on, but what was happening in pockets of Christian communities overlapping with this national conversation. So Faithfully Magazine, which you can find at faithfullymagazine.com, is culturally and racially diverse, as well as ecumenical in scope, and we consider perspectives from all points of the political spectrum. We primarily focus on publishing exclusive Q&As, features. We try to also get timely commentaries representing, wide viewpoints. And we also like to do short profiles. That's our way of, highlighting what local Christians are doing. And we also like to do short historical pieces. In a sense, if you want to look to the future or understand what's going on now, let's take a look back at some of the individuals who inspired some of the things going on today. So that's our focus, and we are primarily national, because that's just how it is for us. But we do try to incorporate local coverage via news and commentaries. So we do try to keep an eye on what's happening that overlaps with our, overall mission in Newark and other parts of New Jersey. And also, once in a while, we'll also get commentary submissions from locals here, which we, try to keep up with and publish. But in terms of how faith reporting can impact civic engagement, I think Deborah also laid out some of that stuff really well. But, if we specifically want to talk about the religion beat, right? That's not like a beat that gets a lot of love, or it didn't used to in general. You save that coverage for the weekend or the Sunday paper, but during the week, not really. But things have changed. Religion is a big part of American life. It's there in almost every facet of the issues we look at. And I think, when news organizations spend more time to talk to people, a lot of the times they'll find out they are religiously motivated. We can't have a presidential election in this country without religion coming into play. And so I think faith reporting helps encourage civic engagement by fostering understanding, demystifying some of the elements around our various religious perspectives. And I think the more faith reporting that is done, and that is done well, I think it helps encourage members of the public to trust the media more, and inspires, I guess, in turn, others in their community to also get engaged because they see their viewpoints are welcomed, they're valued or respected, and that they have a place at the table. And, finally, especially on the local level, I think it also helps with coalition building, specifically with interfaith organizations as well. So I'll end it there. I can't tell if I'm going too long.
Thank you so much for that. So I'm just going to encourage again, if people have questions, please drop them in the chat and we will start asking our speakers. Before we do that, we were actually just going to pause and take a quick photo of the group. We know people tend to slip out at the end. So if people are by their cameras, if they don't mind turning them on briefly for a quick photo. Thanks, everybody. All right, so we're going to go on to the Q&A now. Judith, is there
I just would ask Nicola something that I think religion is not served well by the press in general, I think. So, but just talk about Christianity in the United States is very complex. The landscape is extraordinarily complex, but it seems to me that the public discourse gets captured by the conservative Christian evangelicals. I mean, I'm not even going to Christian nationalism, which I think, from the point of view of early Christianity, is a contradiction in terms. But that's a historic argument I could have with somebody else. But I'm just wondering about, as a journalist, Nicola, it's so complex, and yet it seems as though Christian evangelicals are the only Christianity in the United States. Now, I think your work is trying to correct that, right? And give multiple voices to the very different and diverse understandings of Christianity in the United States. Do you have any insight for me on that?
Oh boy, I don't know if I have insight, but I mean, you're absolutely right. And I guess it may come down to influence. We have a two-party system, right? And the predominant force, I guess you could say, for one of those systems, the Republican Party, has often been religiously affiliated, specifically Christianity, specifically evangelicalism. And the party has historically been predominantly white. And so a lot of those conservative values, especially, when it is political season, we're going to hear a lot about what they care about, why they care about it, and the things that they're advocating for. And it takes a lot of intentional effort, as with other things in the newsroom, to look at the opposite spectrum, so to speak, or to pause and wonder if you're just oversaturation here. Like if your readers would be better served with hearing an alternate viewpoint or a complementary viewpoint sometimes.
Yes.
Just expressed differently and not in that conservative niche that you've just been hammering away at because it seems to be what everyone else is doing and we got to keep up and the other, pressures in the newsroom.
Okay, thank you.
So one of our questions from the chat, it's for Robin. How are you researching stories in the state of 9 million? Do you take pitches? And can you just talk about that process of getting stories and finding stories?
Sure. We get lots of pitches. We get lots of press releases. We have a staff of about 120 journalists for NJ.com. They have ideas. And they cover different beats. So their ideas are based on who they talk to on their beats, our reporters. And although there's only 4 of us who work every day building stories regularly, it's a staff of 120 who supplement that. So there's voices coming in all the time, from phone calls to pitches to press releases to conversations with people we have generally as we cover our beats. There's at least a dozen ideas that have floated around every day that we try to figure out what do people need to know right away. We try to focus on the news. And what's newsy, what's immediate, what's now, although many of our stories are focused on, again, history or something that's happened previously, we still try to focus on now. Otherwise, there's no way we could take even those 12 ideas that may be floating around in a day and narrow it down to one that we can actually get in print that day or online that day.
Absolutely. I'd like to open up that question to our other panelists. If you could talk about your process for finding stories and when you know it's a good story, what are you usually looking for? You can speak either with your current positions or more broadly with your experience as journalists.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm a freelancer, so my general method of finding stories is somebody asks me to write a story and says they will pay me for it. So that's a fairly straightforward process in my case. How do I know it's a good story? I mean, sometimes just your immediately interested, right? I mean, I guess I go by my own personal reaction, if something is intriguing to me and I want to know more about it and I'm curious about the people who are involved in it or the issues that are involved, then I figure that there will be a way for me to make that interesting to readers as well. So I don't think there's not really a formula, right? It's just sort of it's all from, I'm very focused on narrative and people and characters, as it were. So, I'm interested in that aspect of things, especially.
Is there anything you want?
Sure. Well, for me, as the managing editor, I get a lot of emails, a lot of PR pitches, a lot of news releases, and also, the occasional op-ed or commentary pitch also. So we get everything. But I also have my places that I, go to find out what's topical and timely, what has people talking. So I'm also actively looking for stories there or in that fashion. But I guess to decide what makes a good story, I guess it's a combination of various things, right? Who's the person pitching? Do they seem like an authority, like they actually know what they're talking about? Does it seem like they've actually done the work? They have stuff they can show me to back up what they're saying, and also, is what they're presenting to us, is it timely? Is it going to help bring some context or understanding to the things people are talking about right now? Especially with our readership, there's certain things we keep in mind. So yeah, it's a variety of things. But you definitely have those pitches where you can tell, they're just trying to market themselves or their new book or this or that. So yeah.
Yeah, we've all probably gotten those. Okay, so we have another question for Deborah. If the word humanities is not current in news, it can mean the idea is not considered relevant to the public or newsworthy. Can humanities news projects like ours help get the word in play?
I mean, I guess I don't understand why we should be that fixated on the word. It's like what I was trying to say in my little piece was that the word is a word that comes out of academia and out of divisions among disciplines in academia. But out in the real world, most people don't think in terms of humanities versus anything else. I mean, they might think about science because science has a certain currency in our culture, but to me, I'm more interested in trying to encourage journalists to do the things that I talked about, get journalists to think historically or to try to get some historical context, get journalists to, which most journalists already do, to think in terms of personal stories and think about ways that you can get individual points of view into stories, and to get journalists comfortable with thinking about the idea that there's not always a one right, I mean, depending on the story, obviously, but there is not always one right answer. There's not always one perspective that should be privileged. Thinking about multiple perspectives. I mean, this is something that, we're all learning more about as we think more about the diversity of people in our society and which voices have not been listened to over the years, that there are different points of view and different perspectives that we can get to. And all of those I think of as being things that the humanities does and teaches us to do. But I don't particularly feel a need to get journalists to talk about humanities with a capital H. I mean, I just don't think that matters very much. That's my feeling.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on this question?
I'll add one thing. What I think you're talking, or what you're seeking, is more in-depth stories about culture, about history. And I agree with Deborah. You don't have to call it humanities, but if you urge journalists to do more in-depth stories, get more voices in, and not pass by the perspective and history when you write something about something happening right now, that will meet that goal.
I would just add a couple of comments about not necessarily the word. I'm not wedded to that necessarily, but I think both the spiritual, not religious, but the spiritual and the ethical dimensions of our public spaces need to be highlighted, even if we don't, again, come up with definitive answers. But, things like racism, I mean, most people of thoughtful and goodwill could say, this is morally reprehensible, or environmental racism, or overburdened communities. So I think when those stories are told, it's important to highlight the ethical dimensions of those. Now, that could be in opinion pieces. That's fine. But I think, as I said, both the spiritual and the religious, not religious, but ethical dimensions need to have greater prominence in our discourse.
Judith, do you have any other questions for our panelists?
Yes, I have the questions for sort of the two active journalists, Robin and Nicola. Deborah, you are too, but these two are affiliated with institutions of journalism. What sense do you have of your readership? What kind of feedback? Now, I know Mosaic is pretty recent, right? Robin is just like a couple of months and online, but do you get much feedback? Do you get questions? Do you get suggestions? Do you get pushback? I hope you don't get hate mail. And then I'd ask Nicola the same thing.
Well, I can certainly speak for NJ.com.
Yes.
At NJ.com, we get hate mail. We get terrible, nasty letters.
Really? Oh boy.
We get a lot of feedback, and I would say, as the opinion editor, that I get about a dozen emails and letters to the editor that respond to stories we've written, or that comment about stories that we've done in the past. They think we're liberal. They think we're don't understand the issues. They when they disagree with a person, a voice in a story, they criticize us for using that voice in the story.
Mhm.
That person doesn't know what they're talking about. How dare you quote that person? So yeah, we get a lot of feedback. I get calls as well. Yes.
I hope you get some positive feedback too.
We get quite a bit of
Good.
positive feedback.
That's
Not
good.
nearly as much as we'd like, but yes, quite. People tend to let you know when they're
Yes.
angry as opposed to when they like something. Yes.
Of course. Yeah. Nicola, how about you?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We get all kinds of feedback. Thankfully, the hate mail, though, is rare, but we have gotten it. I think we've also, gotten attempted website hacks also. Once in a while, I guess, publish stuff that someone somewhere just doesn't like at all. And we notice a bit of tinkering there technically with some of the tools we have in place. But also once in a while we get supportive letters too, like physical letters, and those things are really rare nowadays. So that's always nice. But one of the things we try to do every year also is do like a reader survey to actively hear from our readership, maybe to learn what issues they're paying attention to, what kind of coverage maybe they would find helpful moving forward. So we always try to keep those channels of communications open, and we'll still get the hate mail too, so that's all right.
We have a new question in the chat.
Just let me add one thing about the situation of hate. As someone who teaches ethics, along with environmental ethics, but I've been puzzling over the prevalence and depth of people's hate over the last 15 or 20 years. And what just occurred to me, Nicola, when I heard you speak, was a wonderful presentation that Maya Angelou did maybe 20 years ago, dealing with issues of hate. And I'm sure it's available somewhere that you could look that up and see how she deals with it. But I think that's a very instructive, she gives a very instructive, powerful antidote to the prevalence of hate in this culture, which we need now more than ever. I mean, maybe the hate's always been there, but the covers have been lifted off. And I see that as a really tremendous challenge to our democracy.
I agree. Thank you, and I'll look for that those
Yeah.
remarks.
I think this might be our last question. It's to Robin. I can imagine people arguing that having Mosaic as a separate site rather than asking NJ.com to address the issues and communities you cover as part of Mosaic's coverage is a kind of marginalization. Is this an issue you think about and can respond to?
Yes, I can respond to it. Have we thought about it? Absolutely. So if you take a gallon of milk and you drop a drop of chocolate in it, will you see the chocolate? Probably not. And that's kind of what the issue is. We wanted to take an empty pail and mix all the colors up together and take out all the crime and take out all the bad stuff and take out the things that when we talked to different groups in the communities that they said, well, you don't write about our community unless there's controversy, unless there's bad news. Well, we wanted to not even deal with that. We didn't want the gallon of milk. We wanted to start fresh and pour the colors in and create our own tableau instead of taking that gallon of milk and then trying to make it different colors.
Mm.
So maybe, and hopefully the goal is that the bigger site, the of all the sites, I mean, it's true of just about any site that has one, a mostly white staff, a mostly male staff, and or small staff as well, that you're not going to be able to do that right away. You just can't do it. But our hope is that as we hire more people, as the population grows, we're about 50% now, Latino, Black, and Asian, as that 50% becomes the majority, as more of those people become journalists, because it's hard to get people of color to become journalists because it doesn't pay very well, to be honest, that we can change that and that our bigger sites will reflect all of those things. But right now, that one, those one or two drops are not changing the picture.
Well said. I'm curious if anybody wants to respond to how would you respond to people that feel that humanities, and I agree with what's been said, that it's the arts, it's the culture, but that coverage is not important.
It's critical. It's life. It's what we do. It's it's the artist, the musician, the concerts we write about, the person who marched in the rally. Those are all important issues that we need to know about, and they get buried in the other stuff of the fire on 15th Street and the car crash that happened on the turnpike and the snowstorm that we expect next week, hopefully not, but it gets buried among that. So yes, we're trying to dig out from those other things and focus on the arts, the culture, the history, the things that really make up life.
Deborah, Nicola, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I was a humanities major way back, so you don't have to persuade me that this stuff is important. I mean, I think that, I think that most people feel that a lot of these things are an integral part of their lives and how they think of, the things that they enjoy doing, the ways that they respond to the world, the ways that they organize their experience. So, and I'm just noting, is it Ashwani's message in the chat that we need to counter the obsession the US currently has with STEM. And I also, as someone who's covered education a lot, that's definitely something that I've run across, that people seem to feel that the only things that are worth studying are the sciences in some form. And, I do feel like as journalists, we need to cover other aspects of human experience and show that those aspects of human experience are worth being curious about. I just don't feel like we necessarily have to label it.
Absolutely. Any last thoughts, Nicola?
I mean, basically, Robin and Deborah said it pretty well, but to not have the humanities as a regular part of our media consumption seems just kind of strange, because I think it goes back to the Socrates quote, right? Live the examined life. The humanities in media helps us appreciate life, how others are doing life, what motivates us in life, what inspires us in life. So I think the idea of less of it would be really strange and complicated. I think we're probably in some aspects, maybe, which is why, some would emphasize keeping humanities in front of journalism, is perhaps maybe the regular reader, the regular consumer takes it for granted. Maybe they don't realize that what they're reading, this story that's moving them, that's giving them ideas about, what to engage in when they step out their house. Maybe they don't really realize that, okay, this is what you would call humanities journalism, or this is it. Um, so yeah, the idea that it doesn't need to be a part of journalism is kind of strange to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to all of our speakers, and thanks, Judith.
Thank you for asking me.
Toss it back to Dee for a final message.
I am so touched. This was just such a powerful hour. And I will add my thanks. Thank you to our co-facilitators, Carlett Spike and Judith Stark. And a huge thanks to our three speakers, Robin Wilson Glover, Deborah Yaffe, and Nicola Menzie. We greatly appreciate all the insights you've shared so generously and all the thoughts that it sparked and the questions in the chat. Thanks to our audience for your presence and dialogue. If any are new to CivicStory, we invite you to sign up for our weekly newsletters, which come by email on Thursdays. You can find a sign up link on our CivicStory homepage. Also, as a nonprofit organization that relies on donations, CivicStory is excited to be in a matching year-end campaign in which donations up to $1,000 will be matched. You can give online or by check, and gifts of any amount are warmly and greatly appreciated and welcome. And you can, on the site, click on any of the donation buttons. And I believe Amalia up, and she already has shared the link. Again, thanks to the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for supporting this forum, and our Humanities Reporter project. Keep an eye out for Deborah's story next week on the Newark City of Learning Collaborative. To all, our very best wishes for the holidays, our hopes for good health, peace, and healing in 2024. Thank you.